Good morning, students. Today we will be talking about the end of bipolarity. This is chapter 2 of book Contemporary World Politics. Today we will be talking about creation of USSR, features, benefits and drawbacks of the Soviet system, role of Gorbachev in disintegration of USSR, and finally the causes of disintegration of USSR. But before we start, have you noticed the first page of this chapter? A picture shows a group of people standing together. What do you think they are doing? They are participating in an historical event known as the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall symbolized the division between the capitalist and the communist world, built in 1961 to separate East Berlin from West Berlin. This more than 150-kilometer long wall stood for 28 years and was finally broken by the people on 9th November 1989. This marked the unification of two parts of Germany and the beginning of the end of the communist bloc. Let's go into the history to find out how USSR was created. It was created after the Bolshevik Revolution that took place in Russia in 1917. The revolution was inspired by the ideals of socialism and the need for an egalitarian society. The abolition of private property and equality as the basis of society were the key features. The primacy of state with welfarist role through the Communist Party with the system of planned economy was created. Can you recall anything? The system of planning? Yes, this was the same system adopted by India after its independence under the concept of 5-year plans. After the Second World War, the East European countries that the Soviet army had liberated from the fascist forces came under the control of USSR. The political and economic systems of all these countries were modeled after the USSR. This group of countries were called the Second World or the Socialist Bloc. The Warsaw Pact was the military alliance under the leadership of USSR. The Soviet Union became a great power after the Second World War. The Soviet economy was then more developed than the rest of the world except the US. It had a complex communications network, vast energy resources, including oil, iron and steel, and a transport sector that connected its remotest of areas with efficiency. It had a domestic consumer industry that produced everything from pins to cars, though their quality did not match that of the Western capitalist countries. The Soviet state ensured a minimum standard of living for all citizens, and the government subsidized basic necessities including health, education, childcare, etc. Also, there was no unemployment. State ownership was the dominant form of ownership. Land and productive assets were owned and controlled by the Soviet state. The Soviet system became very bureaucratic and authoritarian. Lack of democracy and the absence of freedom of speech stifled people who often expressed their dissent in jokes and cartoons. Although on paper, Russia was only one of the 15 republics that together constituted the USSR. But in reality, Russia dominated everything, and people from other regions felt neglected and often suppressed. The Soviet Union lagged behind the West in technology, infrastructure, and, most importantly, in fulfilling the political or economic aspirations of its citizens. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 weakened the system even further. This led to shortages in all consumer goods. Food imports obviously increased. The Soviet economy was faltering in the late 1970s and became stagnant. Who was Gorbachev? This was the man who was the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Soviet Union in 1985, who sought to reform the Soviet system. Reforms were necessary to keep up the USSR abreast of information and technological revolutions taking place in the West. Gorbachev's decision to normalize relations with the West and democratize and reform the Soviet Union had some other effects that neither he nor anyone else anticipated. The people in East European countries, which were part of the Soviet bloc, started to protest. The reforms were opposed by leaders within the Communist Party. A coup took place in 1991. Boris Yeltsin emerged as a national hero in opposing this coup. Power began to shift from the Soviet center to the republics, especially in the more Europeanized part of the Soviet Union, which saw themselves as sovereign states. In December 1991, under the leadership of Yeltsin, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, three major republics of USSR, declared that the Soviet Union was disbanded. The Communist Party of Soviet Union was banned. Capitalism and democracy were adopted as the basis for post-Soviet republics. The next topic that we will ponder upon is the causes of disintegration. There were four main causes, namely economic, political, Gorbachev's reforms, and the rise of nationalism. Let's first try to answer, why did the Soviet economy stagnate? The Soviet economy used much of its resources in maintaining a nuclear and military arsenal and the development of its satellite states in East Europe and within the Soviet system. This led to a huge economic burden. Ordinary citizens became more knowledgeable about the economic advancement of the West. After years of being told that the Soviet system was better than the Western capitalism, the reality of its backwardness came as a political and psychological shock. The Soviet Union had become stagnant in administrative and political sense also. Ordinary people were alienated by slow and stifling administration, rampant corruption, the inability of the system to correct mistakes it had made, the unwillingness to allow more openness in government and centralization of authority in a vast land. The party bureaucrats gained more privileges than ordinary citizens. The government increasingly lost popular backing. Gorbachev's reforms promised to deal with these problems. Gorbachev promised to reform the economy, catch up with the West, and loosen the administrative system. But there were sections of Soviet society which felt that Gorbachev should have moved much faster and were disappointed and impatient with his methods. On the other hand, members of the Communist Party felt that their power and privileges were eroding and Gorbachev was moving too quickly. In this tug of war, Gorbachev lost support on all sides and divided public opinion. Another reason was the rise of nationalism and the desire for sovereignty within various republics, including Russia and the Baltic republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, along with others, proved to be the final and most immediate cause for the disintegration of the USSR. This is it for the day. But before we end, let's quickly recap the points that we learned today. First, we talked about creation of USSR in 1917. Fall of the Berlin Wall symbolized the end of bipolar world. The key features of Soviet system included equality, planned economy, and abolition of private property. The key benefits includes subsidies in the area of health and education, no unemployment, and vast energy resources like oil, iron and steel, etc. The domination of Russia alienated the people of other Baltic states. Stagnant economy and lack of rights were the key drawbacks of the Soviet system. For its rescue, Gorbachev offered political and economic reforms but couldn't save USSR from disintegration. Thank you.